Today, I'll be putting bullies, nerds, emos, and popular kids against each other in one big battle. We'll see which of these four groups comes out on top. Will it be the bullies with their aggression, brute strength, and not much brain power? The nerds with their big brains but little physical strength? The popular kids with their stunning looks and irresistible charm? Or the emos with their emo stuff? We've got the map divided into 4 sections, each with a biome that fits the personality of its group. In the Savannah quadrant, we'll place a tribe of orcs representing the bullies. In the Grassland quadrant, we'll put a group of humans. They'll play the nerds. Then, over in the dark and gloomy swamp biome, we'll drop in a bunch of skeletons. They're not the perfect fit, but for now, they'll do a decent job representing the emos. And finally, in the candy biome, we'll add a bunch of flower people to represent the popular kids. If you're wondering why I picked that color, the answer is pretty simple. Because in the life of the populars, everything's just sweet and pink. On top of everything we've already set up, we're also giving each group a few traits that match their personalities perfectly. The bullies get the traits tough, giant, strong, evil, stupid, savage, and hot-headed. Pretty fitting, right? As for the nerds, we gave them pacifist, short-sighted, ugly, genius, weak, peaceful, which appears to differ from pacifist, strong-minded, and unlucky. Basically, they're built for brains, not brawls. Now, the emos were a bit trickier to define, but in the end, we went with toxic, paranoid, thorns, and bloodlust. Yeah, sounds about right. And finally, the populars got agile, fast, fertile, lucky, attractive, lustful, and of course, the one that lets them drop flowers wherever they walk. Alright, everything's ready, so let's hit play and watch them explore their surroundings. The nerds immediately start building their kingdom and crown their king, while the populars begin spreading fast, planting roots everywhere from the very start. I'm guessing you can already tell that's going to give them a bit of an advantage. The emos, on the other hand, are off to a surprisingly good start. They decided to build a storage hut first, then a campfire, a move that shows a bit more planning on their side. I'm also starting to notice a few snakes slithering around their area, but since the emos have the toxic trait, that might not actually be such a bad thing for them. Meanwhile, the flowers have started growing little buds that turn into newborns, and of course, they immediately put them to work the second they're born. We've just hit the 10-year mark, and you can already see how differently each kingdom has progressed. The bullies and the populars have focused almost entirely on boosting their population, while the emos, even though their numbers haven't increased at all, have expanded their territory quite a bit. The nerds sit somewhere in between, growing both their land and their population at a steady, balanced pace. Looking inside the bullies' territory, we can see they've built several tents and already started upgrading a few of them. They're also stocking up on supplies in their storage hut. The nerds, though, are one step ahead. Their houses are more developed, and they're showing clear signs of organization. They've even started paving roads to connect every home together. Their storage doesn't look too full yet, but they've made solid progress by building a windmill, which should help them keep a steady food supply early on. Meanwhile, the populars have also made some decent progress. They haven't built a windmill yet, but they do have a fancy palace for their queen, who, by the way, happens to be strolling around the area right now. The difference between the emos' territory and the populars is pretty striking. The emos have claimed a huge stretch of land, but barely populated it. Most of their activity stays near the campfire, where a few small houses and their king's palace stand. Beyond that, they haven't done much, just holding their ground without really developing it further. By year 40, things have escalated even more than before. The bullies and the populars are still holding the top spots in total population, although bullies are currently dealing with some serious problems. Luckily, the flames seem to be drifting away from the capital, so they shouldn't have too much to worry about. Inside the village, life looks pretty good. They've built a ton of new tents, which has led to a big population boom. They've also finished a royal palace, a windmill, and are in the middle of building their very first mine, which will definitely help them push their progress even further down the line. The nerds, meanwhile, have been busy putting up new houses and upgrading them as much as their technology allows. They've still got that mine from earlier, showing that overall they're actually more advanced than the bullies. Even if their population is smaller, they've even built a palace and a water well to make sure everyone in the kingdom stays healthy and comfortable. As for the populars, who still sit in second place population-wise, they've made some solid progress too. Not much more than necessary, but just enough to keep their reputation intact. They haven't expanded their territory beyond the initial settlement, but they did manage to build a siege tower, something neither the bullies nor the nerds have been able to develop so far. Lastly, the emos are practically in the same situation as the populars, with the only difference being that they don't have any siege towers. What's more concerning is their situation in terms of territorial expansion and housing density. They've occupied almost their entire quadrant, yet they haven't built a single additional house outside the central area. In contrast, the bullies have made progress in that regard, and as they've just established established a brand new settlement with several tents, and even built their own independent storage hut. And that brings us to the end of the 1st century. By this point, both the nerds and the emos have taken over almost their entire quadrants, though they haven't exactly made the best use of them. The bullies, on the other hand, with a much smaller territory, have managed to gain a clear advantage in overall population. This is mainly because they've built a huge number of tents, and even though not all of them have been upgraded, the sheer quantity has allowed them to house way more families than the other kingdoms. On top of that, they've established fully functional secondary settlements, each with its own palace, windmill, and storage hut, giving them total independence from the main kingdom and letting them keep growing without relying directly on the capital. The nerds, on the other hand, while keeping a pretty efficient and well-structured organization, have made some truly impressive progress. They've upgraded nearly all their houses, reinforcing them with concrete for extra durability, and even built a marketplace that allows citizens to trade freely with one another. They also have siege towers and training barracks where we can actually see soldiers practicing, along with a library that will no doubt help spark the development of new knowledge and technologies. Still, despite all these improvements, their overall housing density remains much lower than that of the bullies. As for the emos, even though they've built a decent number of tents, their population is limited by constant internal conflicts that lead to fights among their own people, keeping them from growing normally. Even so, they've built training barracks, which is actually quite impressive. Their storage hut is packed with valuable resources, and they've finally managed to establish a fully independent secondary settlement with its own palace, windmill, and storage hut. On top of that, several siege towers can be seen scattered around the outskirts, showing a clear intent to strengthen the kingdom's defenses against any future invasions. The populars, meanwhile, have built 2 secondary settlements and made the kind of progress you'd expect at this stage, including the construction of training barracks and what looks like a library, since you can see several citizens walking around with books in hand nearby. Still, despite all these improvements and the huge amount of territory they control, they remain dead last in population. It's honestly alarming. Even the emos, who are constantly fighting and killing each other, have managed to surpass them. Here we can see the charts showing the current state of each kingdom. The nerds' population has grown exponentially, which led to a sharp rise in homelessness. However, they've handled it surprisingly well over the past 30 years, while also increasing their number of soldiers. The emos, on the other hand, show a much more erratic pattern. Their population skyrocketed about 40 years ago, but has barely changed since, staying completely stagnant. Even so, that slowdown might have actually helped them, since it allowed them to drastically reduce the homelessness that came from that out-of-control growth during previous decades. The populars have been growing at a steady, linear pace over time. However, they still haven't managed to solve their homelessness problem, which remains almost as high as their military population, something seriously concerning and a bit alarming. Meanwhile, the bullies are in a very similar situation, except they've actually handled the homelessness issue remarkably well, keeping it at very low levels while significantly increasing their number of soldiers. And that brings us to the year 300. By this point, the bullies have taken a massive lead in total population, reaching nearly 1,000 inhabitants and surpassing 400 soldiers. The nerds, on the other hand, remain in second place in total population, but have a much weaker army, barely 200 soldiers, placing them dead last in terms of military strength. The bullies' impressive growth comes from 2 main factors. First, their complete domination of their quadrant, and second, the massive number of tents they've built, strategically placed to cover as much ground as possible. This setup has allowed them to house far more citizens, squeezing every bit of space available inside their territory. The nerds, meanwhile, have also built a lot more homes than before, making better use of the land they have. But their more organized layout, while visually neat, actually works against them. Their rigid structure keeps them from using the terrain as efficiently as the bullies do, which limits their potential for expansion. The populars, on the other hand, are still pretty underwhelming when it comes to housing density. At least they're slowly expanding their capital, though. They've even started building a few settlements on the edges of their quadrant that are gradually filling up, so there's a good chance they'll manage to occupy their entire territory in the future. The emos, though, seem pretty much hopeless at this point. Their capital is completely filled, forming an almost perfect circle, but beyond that, they only have a tiny settlement up in the corner of the map, with no signs of expansion or real progress anywhere. Here, we can see the charts in a bit more detail. After 3 full centuries have gone by, they show how the bullies have kept increasing their population at a steady, consistent rate, while keeping homelessness practically non-existent. Thanks to the massive number of homes they've built across their territory, The nerds, meanwhile, struggled to grow between years 100 and 200, but around 50 years ago, they managed to turn things around, and their population growth has been looking much stronger ever since. The emos are in a very similar situation to the nerds, with one key difference. Their homelessness rate keeps going up and hasn't stabilized like the nerds did over the last decade. I got curious about the crime situation, and while it's still high, at least it's been stable for roughly the last 150 years. Things look very different for the populars though. Their population, military size, and homelessness have all been rising at nearly the same rate, along with their crime rate, which is now climbing fast. In fact, over the past decade, it's spiked sharply, which could seriously hurt their future growth. That's probably why they still haven't managed to break past the 500 inhabitant mark. We've finally reached a full millennium, and by this point, everything has completely flipped. The populars, who had been dead last in population for centuries, have suddenly exploded in growth, now surpassing 1,500 inhabitants, with over 600 of them serving as soldiers. In second place are the Bullies, sitting at around 1,200 citizens and just over 400 active troops. Behind them are the Emos, with roughly 759 inhabitants and about 474 soldiers, nearly 500 total. And last, we've got the Nerds, who haven't just stopped growing, but actually lost around 200 people since last time, dropping their army to barely over 130 soldiers, leaving them far behind every other kingdom. It's clear their pacifist nature has seriously limited them when it comes to military strength. As for internal progress, the Bullies have managed to upgrade nearly all of their buildings, though a few tents can still be spotted here and there. Even so, their army is looking solid, fully equipped with high-quality steel weapons and armor. The Nerds, on the other hand, have done almost nothing lately. They've built a few extra houses, but it hasn't made much of a difference. Their population keeps shrinking. Most of their soldiers seem more interested in reading than in training, which perfectly explains why they're so unprepared for what's coming. The populars, meanwhile, have somehow managed to fill almost their entire quadrant with homes, which clearly explains their massive population spike, something that was bound to happen given how fast they'd been growing in recent centuries. Still, the internal chaos is starting to show. Many of them are demoralized, terrified, and obsessed with death, constantly mourning and complaining about their fate. Let's just hope that lack of motivation doesn't mess them up once the fighting begins. As for the Emos, they haven't expanded as much as the populars, but their population has grown, and they've slightly widened the outer ring of their capital. Something interesting I just noticed, the Bullies have set up entire lines of watchtowers along their border with the Emos to prevent future invasions. They've also built several scattered towers within their own territory, giving their defenses some extra strength. Anyway, it's finally time to kick off the battle. We'll tear down the wall and hit play so they can start interacting and fighting each other. A few nerds approached the border trying to make contact with the Bullies, while the Bullies themselves were already pushing toward nerd territory. Eventually, the moment everyone was waiting for arrived, the Bullies went all in, launching a direct attack on the nerds with the goal of wiping them out completely. Despite having a small army, the nerds threw everything they had into one desperate attempt to defend their kingdom. On the emo side, something seemed to be brewing, though it wasn't clear what exactly. Meanwhile, the Bullies kept pushing forward non-stop, invading the entire nerd territory, burning down nearly every building along the border and wiping out most of their population until they completely conquered them. Right after that, the Bullies turned their sights on the populars. However, the populars and the emos decided to join forces and strike back, taking advantage of the fact that the Bullies were still weakened from their recent victory. With both armies combined, it looked like they might actually pull it off and take full control of Bully territory. But the Bullies weren't about to go down that easily. They sent their entire army to stop the emo invasion, forcing them to retreat, and the populars had no choice but to pull back to their capital as well, digging in to rebuild their numbers before the next wave of war. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening in the Bullies quadrant. Their kingdom had split into 4 smaller independent realms, which massively weakened their power and left them far more vulnerable to invasions. In the capital, chaos broke out as the emos temporarily joined forces to completely destroy every remaining structure, wiping out the few Bullies still alive. Most of the population were civilians, with barely any active soldiers left, so the defense collapsed almost instantly. However, just after the emos managed to drive the Bullies out of the capital, one of the newly formed Bully kingdoms launched a counterattack, pushing the emos back and leaving them severely weakened, with fewer than 100 citizens left. The populars, on the other hand, still had over 1,200 inhabitants, putting them in a strong position, practically guaranteeing them 2 easy victories as long as they played their cards right in the next few moves. With a massive assault, the populars launched their final offensive against one of the secondary Bully kingdoms, tearing cutting through everything in their path. They burned down countless homes and torched resource storages, joined by the Emos attacking from another front to weaken the defenses. Together, they managed to destroy the siege tower, opening a direct path to the heart of the enemy's territory. It didn't take long before the entire area fell under popular control, leaving the Bullies cornered in a tiny patch of land up north. But that last strip of land didn't stay in their hands for long. The populars noticed that nearly all remaining Bullies were just children, and took the chance to unleash a devastating attack that completely wiped out the final remnants of their kingdom. And just like that, the Bully Empire was no more, its fall marking the end of an era. Right after that, the populars began celebrating their massive victory, though maybe they shouldn't have gotten too comfortable, because the Emos were still around, slowly rebuilding their population once again. At this point, it was only a matter of time before one of the two decided to declare war and kick off the final battle. But before that could happen, in a completely unexpected twist, the Emos decided they'd had enough of living and started turning on each other, wiping themselves out from within. The populars, seeing the perfect chance, didn't hesitate for a second. They declared war and sent their army to finish off the few Emos that were still alive. A small group of Emos, still somewhat sane, tried to fight back with whatever they had left, but there was simply no way to withstand such an overwhelming attack. One by one, they were hunted down and eliminated, marking the ultimate victory of the populars, who celebrated their total and undeniable domination over every other group in the world.